Okay. Hi everyone. My name's George and I'm from Revu, which is a Rails development company in the UK. We're spending a few days out here with our friends from Siklam and we're looking to set up a team in Kiev, so if anyone wants to talk about that, grab me later. But what I'm really here to talk to you about today is writing maintainable front-end code in Ruby on Rails applications. Well, why would I want to talk about JavaScript and CSS at a Ruby conference? Because Ruby is only half the battle. When we're building web applications, and as Ruby developers, most of us are. Sorry, I'll try and slow down for the translation. When we're building web applications, which most of us are as Ruby developers, then what we run on the server, what we write in Ruby is only half of the application. There's code running on the client, there's the JavaScript, and there's the CSS. And while Rails is amazing at telling us how to structure our Ruby code and splitting it neatly into models and controllers and views, the code that runs on the client, the JavaScript and the CSS, Rails tells us very little about how we should structure that and how we should write it. And if we want our front-end code to be maintainable, then really we need to have good structures so that we can test it, so that we can reuse it, and so that we can find what we need to change. So let's start by looking at JavaScript and Rails. Now, Rails is famous for having really good AJAX support, and ever since the early versions of Rails there's been various JavaScript helpers which allow us to do simple things, forms which submit via XHR, XML HTTP request instead of via a normal browser request. But historically these things weren't so great. Well, hooray for Rails 3, because things are so much better now. The JavaScript helpers are now unobtrusive and framework agnostic. The unobtrusive part means our applications will still work without JavaScript even if we're using the helpers. And the framework agnostic part means that we can get rid of prototype and use something else like jQuery if we want to, if it works better for this project or for this team. Let's just have a really quick look at what things were like in Rails 2. So if you ran a link to remote helper in Rails 2, you get this massive blob of HTML. And the first thing you'll notice is the href is meaningless. Also, the next thing, there's an on-click right in the HTML, which I don't think belongs there. I think in the same way as we don't want our model code in our views or in our controllers, we don't want our JavaScript code in our HTML. And then thirdly, there's this AJAX request, which is part of the prototype. Moving on to Rails 3, everything is much simpler. For a start, we're calling link to instead of link to remote, which means we're sort of thinking about this as a normal link, not some kind of special magic JavaScript link. The href is real, so if JavaScript's turned off, that will still work. And we're using this HTML5 data attribute to say to the JavaScript, oh, when you find this link, you should enhance it. But it's still just simple stuff. It's still just allowing us to get little bits of code from the server, and eventually the helpers, they're not enough. We have to write our own JavaScript when we're doing more complicated things. Now, all Rails really gives us by default to support this is an empty file called application.js and a note saying, put your code in here. I think there's ways we can do this better and ways we can structure this better. So let's have a look at some structured JavaScript code. Now, JavaScript is very different to Ruby in some ways and very similar in other ways. One of the ways it's different is that JavaScript has no concept of classes or modules. So the only way you can create a sort of blocked off scope where all the variables are nicely encapsulated and nicely protected is by using either a function or an object. So in this case, we're creating a namespace called myapp.imageGallery, so we instantly know at a glance what this is, and I would put this in imagegallery.js, and then we create a function. Now the function, if you look at the very last line of code on the slide, you'll notice the function is called immediately. So what we're assigning to myapp.imageGallery isn't the function itself, but the return value from the function, which means that the next thing you see is private to that function and can't be accessed from outside. Now this is really good for several reasons. Firstly, it means we can create lots of little helper variables and methods without overriding each other when we're working in lots of different .js files. Secondly, we're expressing our intent so other developers can see what we wanted them to call and what we didn't. And then we return an object which is the public interface to our image gallery. So if you look at myapp.imageGallery from outside of this code, all you would see would be a method called showLightbox. So once we've got our JavaScript packaged like that into a neat little bundle, how can we make sure that certain features get turned on some pages and not from others? It's inefficient to load lots of little JavaScript files because there's overhead for every HTTP request that we do, and we can benefit from caching if we're loading the same JavaScript on every page. But we don't want lots and lots of scripts to be querying the browser and saying, oh, is this element here, can I change this, do I need to do this? Because it would get really, really inefficient. So instead, when we're initializing the right scripts, we can ask the HTML what it needs. Now the way that we tend to handle this is we add classes to the body, which tell the JavaScript this is what this particular piece of HTML needs to be run against it, needs to be used to enhance it. So we have a common prefix which is with JS, and then next we have the name of the feature that we want to enable. So on this particular page we're saying this is a page with a JavaScript image gallery, and then we don't have to bother running our initialization code for any of our other bits of JavaScript. This is really helpful for debugging. If I view the source of this page, I instantly know what's getting turned on and what isn't. But once we know which bits of JavaScript we want to initialize, we need a common API in order to initialize them. So we define two methods. We have global init, which is run on every page. There are some bits of JavaScript that you do want everywhere, and in that case you shouldn't have to add a class to the body of every page. And then we have an init method, which is only run when it's needed. And by when it's needed, I mean when that with JS image gallery class is present on the body. And then we have a little bit of glue, which just iterates over the features we've defined and only initializes the right ones. It's probably not worth going through this, but it's included in the slides so that if you want to have a look at it or do something like this later yourselves, then it's there for reference. But what about Ajax? So sometimes we're loading more bits of HTML and adding them to our document after the page is loaded. If we've just looked at the body class once and started all our JavaScript at that point, then when things are loaded with Ajax, we're going to be stuck. Well, we can use a custom HTTP header in the same way that we use the body class. And then in the JavaScript, we can use something like this to read it. Again, we need a little bit of glue code to read these and initialize the right features. But that's trivial to write. There is a problem, though, when you initialize something with Ajax that you might end up calling init twice. So say we have this div with class of gallery, and when we run our image gallery JavaScript against it, we end up adding a link. So the first time it runs, this happens. So we have a link, that's great. And that's happened when the document was first loaded. But then if we run we make an Ajax call to the server and we add some more HTML to this page, which adds another gallery somewhere else on the page, and we run the init function again for the gallery, this happens. We get two more links. Now that's not really ideal. So to get around this, we have to write defensive init functions. So this is the init function which caused that duplication. It's quite simple, it's just finding the galleries and it's adding to them. So the first thing we do is we exclude galleries which have already got a class of enhanced. And then the second thing we do is that we add a class of enhanced to the ones that we've processed. So this means we only ever add this more link once. It's a trivial example, but there are places where this gets quite complicated, and if you have many init functions being run on the same page and some of them run many times, this kind of thing is really helpful. Also, having a class of enhanced helps you to helps you to add JavaScript-specific styles. So, for example, if you wanted to style that more link in a particular way, you could attach the styles for that to the class of enhanced. But this is all a lot of work. We're adding classes to the body, we're adding custom headers, we're doing all kinds of things. So this is where Rails can really help us out. If we define a few simple helpers, it's only 5 or 6 lines of Ruby, then we can do something like this example here at the bottom of the slide. So we can say, here is a div with class gallery, and it uses JavaScript for image gallery. Now that call to use JavaScript for, you can see at the top, is doing 2 things. It's adding the image gallery feature to a list of features that we can use to generate the body classes, and also setting an HTTP header. So it doesn't matter if we render that bit of HTML at the bottom there, or sorry, that bit of ERB at the bottom in a normal request or in an AJAX request. The JavaScript is going to be initialized in both cases. So we have another helper. We have another helper which generates the list of class names to add to the body based on those calls to use JavaScript for. Now, having calls to use JavaScript for in your HTML is also really helpful, because when you're editing the ERB or HAML or whatever templates you use, you can see that, oh, this bit of HTML is expecting some JavaScript to run against it, and that JavaScript is called image gallery, and I can find it in imagegallery.js. So it helps tie things together, and it helps you understand the relationship between your templates and your JavaScript files. So that's some JavaScript and how to structure our JavaScript. Let's have a quick look at CSS. There's not really as much to say here, because CSS is far more simple than JavaScript. It's not really a programming language, it's just a list of rules. But there are some things we can do to help us make it maintainable. The first thing is to call things what they are. This is probably obvious, but if something's a product, it should be called a product. Just because it's got rounded corners, we shouldn't call it rounded corners, because we know what designers are like. Next week they've changed their mind and it doesn't have rounded corners anymore, and our class names don't make sense. The second thing is to split stuff up into useful files. So, for example, we use a reset.js. That just smooths out the differences between browsers. Then we use elements, which sets up our default sizes and typography and paddings on things like paragraphs. And then we have layout, which sets up the specific layout for our website. And then we would have more files for more specific features. Again, having a file for every feature is useful, because you can see that imagegallery.erb and imagegallery.js and imagegallery.css are all related. So now we know how to structure our front-end code well. How do we serve it from our Rails applications? Rails does provide some basic things like the JavaScript include tag and stylesheet link tag helpers, which can take lots of JavaScript files and compress them together into one. But really, keeping things in the public directory is quite simple. At RailsConf this year, this is what DHH had to say about the subject. And he thinks that we've been neglecting style sheets in JavaScript and the ways we can optimize them for a long time, and that we shouldn't do that anymore. Especially since we tend to look at the things in public like it's a messy junk drawer for the designers, and the things in app are the serious code. And there are lots of benefits to putting the JavaScript and the CSS into the app and having them served by a controller and rendered in the same way as an HTML page. We can do additional processing, such as minification. An example which DHH gives in his RailsConf presentation is that we can generate CSS sprites more easily if we can use helper methods in our CSS. And also there are big benefits for doing internationalization. If you look at this ERB JavaScript, we could rewrite that more link that we used a few slides ago to include a little bit of Rails code, a little i18n call, and suddenly it's internationalized. Notice that I've used to JSON there. That's because JSON, the data format, is a subset of JavaScript. So any object that in Rails we can convert to JSON, we can just drop straight into our JavaScript code, and it will be properly escaped and with the right quotation and the right literal object syntax or array syntax already for us. And it's great that this kind of stuff is coming in a future version of Rails. It's fantastic that this is sort of on the cards for Rails 3.1 and that the core team are paying attention to it. But there's also things we can do now. So what are they? Well, on a basic level, we already have access to controllers and routes and ERB. They're in every Rails app. So rolling our own versions of this are quite easy. But who wants to reinvent the wheel every time? So there are also some gems and plugins that already exist. The first one is Rails CSS Views. This was written by Richard Hulse. It was directly inspired by DHH's RailsConf talk this year. And its main goal is to support ERB and CSS and move the CSS files out of the junk drawer, as DHH called it, and into the application code. It can concatenate multiple CSS files, and you can apply lots of transformers to it. So any object which responds to a transform method can be used to take the CSS and turn it into something else. So for example, you could take a lot of CSS with comments and spacing, and you could minify it just by having a minifier object which responded to transform. Next up, there's Sprockets. This was written by 37 Signals. It's used to concatenate and minify scripts, and it also goes further than that and builds a tree of dependencies. So you can use specially formatted comments in your JavaScript to say that this bit of script relies on another file, and Sprockets will pull all the different scripts you need in, combine them into a single file. It also has many other features to do with bundling assets, so if a bit of JavaScript needs an image and that's not used elsewhere in your application, you can put it in a Sprockets plugin and it will be pulled in along with the JavaScript. It doesn't support ERB, unfortunately, so we don't have the full power of Ruby within our JavaScript, but it does have simple string replacement, so we can create a YAML file with a bunch of constants and a bunch of strings, and it will swap the constants for the strings as it renders the JavaScript. And then finally, we have JavaScript features. This is something that we're in the process of creating at Rebu. It's based on a lot of the ideas that were in this presentation, which are the solutions we've found to real problems. It's work in progress, but it includes all the use JavaScript for and body classes and init functions that you've seen in this presentation. So if you want to play with that stuff, then you should definitely clone this repository. That's been quite a short overview of front-end code and where it's going and what we can do now, but hopefully it's been useful. Has anyone got any questions? If you don't want to ask them right now, then my contact details are on the slide, so get hold of me later.
Sergey Kish, what is the purpose of making JavaScript unobtrusive for you? Because links in links browser will not work with links that you showed, for example. And maybe about speech browsers. What do you think about what you say, guys that wrote about a lot about compatibility with for blind people, etc. And JavaScript on their browsers?
I completely agree with you. I think it's very important that our sites work without JavaScript. But JavaScript is a very useful part of our applications to help out when it is available. So I wouldn't want to write anything which didn't work without JavaScript. But when the JavaScript is there, I want it to be well structured and maintainable and easy to find and easy to test. So I'm not talking about writing our JavaScript so it's a definite requirement of the app, just structuring it in such a way that we can maintain it more easily.
And okay, so most simple question. Rails 3 links in browsers without JavaScript support will target on the resource, which should be, for example, deleted, put, etc. So it will not delete that resource.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, Elliot, could you just jump back to like the second or third slide, the Rails 2 and 3 examples? So in Rails 2, this is what happened when you used a remote link, and this doesn't work without JavaScript.
Yes,
so in links this wouldn't work. And then on the next slide, this is what Rails 3 is doing, which would work without JavaScript. And this is much, much better. This is a really good step forward for Rails. So the way this works is that the data-remote is just an annotation which says if JavaScript is available, then we should use it for this link. But if it isn't, we'll just fall back and use the href like a normal link would.
So links browser will go to resource page, and in that page we should place, for example, link for a mobile engine, right?
Yes. So links will just go to /, but if we've structured our application well, then that should work without the JavaScript anyway. So maybe I didn't explain some of my assumptions well enough at the beginning. JavaScript really should be kind of the icing on top of the cake. It should be just a thing on top of a working web application. So if the application doesn't already work without JavaScript, then I don't think we should be writing big chunks of JavaScript to put on top of it.
Thank you.
What do you think about using Haml for managing CSS files?
Haml for CSS files. It was my understanding that Haml is for HTML.
Yeah.
Oh, Sass.
Sass,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. Personally, I'm not a fan of Sass. I think most of the problems it solves aren't real problems. They're just people have looked at CSS and thought, oh, I don't like the way that works, I'd rather it worked in a different way. I have used it, I don't really like it, but that's just my opinion. If you use it, then that's cool. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious because latest CSS is fully compatible with CSS3, so you don't have to have their own syntax.
No, but Sass introduces things like nesting, which I think make the CSS more difficult to maintain, because when nesting is used to extremes, it's difficult to find things. Similarly, mixins, I think the way CSS works with just one selector, then a comma, then another selector, is more helpful than a mixin for understanding how the style sheet works. But I mean, again, that's just my opinion. If you do find Sass helpful, and if your team find it helpful, then I'm not saying you shouldn't use it.
I have a question about the header that you said on one slide. I haven't quite understood what was it for.
Okay. So when we load a page just using a normal browser request, we set the with.js image gallery as a class on the body, so the JavaScript can see that and knows to initialize that. If we load the image gallery via Ajax, when the Ajax load is finished and we've added the gallery to the document, we still need to run that initializer. So by putting the image gallery into an X with JavaScript header, when our Ajax call is finished, we can examine that header and say, oh, the thing we've just downloaded includes an image gallery, so we should call imagegallery.init for this bit of HTML.
Okay.
Is that clear?
Yeah. And one more thing. Sorry for taking time for questions, but that thing that you said about Rails 3.1, it will be done, I think, in Rails 3.1, and it will also help engines with using JavaScript. So, because right now you must copy all the assets to your application, and when you have controllers to do that, it could be rendered automatically. So it will also be good for multiple applications.
What if you need to load on page 2 image galleries, or 3 or more?
So The JavaScript initialization function will look for all the image galleries in the page and will add whatever it needs to add to each of them in turn. And then if you load another one by Ajax, you call it again. So there was a slide about writing the initialization functions to make sure they mark the image gallery as this one's already had JavaScript added, so don't do it again, because otherwise you can end up in a mess. Does that help?
Just about that, I have a little bit of nitpicking, because you, in the slide where you shown how to prevent loading the JavaScript initializer for an element twice.
Yes.
You're adding a class named enhanced to it, and that wouldn't work if you have a couple of such selectors. So, for example, if you have a link that's supposed to, I don't know, load something via Ajax request and be click tracked or something like that, and those are two different views, those two different init functions.
Yeah.
One would load, the other wouldn't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we can't always use something simple like enhanced. Actually, in practice, in our real code, we would use here enhanced image gallery or JS image gallery. I was trying to keep it simple and I missed something when I was simplifying it. Sorry about that. But thanks for pointing it out.
Hi. In those Rails 3 stuff that on obstructive JavaScript, there is a slight problem with delayed action. I mean, delayed method doesn't work in this case if JavaScript is disabled. How do you solve such problems?
I would say that if you want to delete a record or do anything else that involves a post action, so in Rails we talk about delete and put and post. Most browsers only support post, so as far as the JavaScript's concerned, it really is just get or post. So anything that's using post, I don't think we should be using link to. That's actually, I think, the one remaining problem in the Rails 3 helpers. I personally solved that problem by using a form for and then just styling it to look like a link. There's an excellent CSS tutorial called Styling Buttons to Look Like Links, and if you Google that, then there's lots of tricks to get around all the strange things that browsers do with buttons. But you can make a button look like a link but still be a button and therefore work without JavaScript.
One notice about posting and delete action. Actually, if you see to the Apache documentation about the REST protocol, you can see that you can emulate the delete put options by post on this DD parameter method, post method. So you can do anything only by post. So that's just documentation.
No, that's right. Yeah, the JavaScript sees it as a post, but Rails sees it as a delete or a put.
Hi, one question. Why we use headers? Why we can't use a class in DOM which is tuning from server?
Because it's not always, you're not always loading HTML from the server. Sometimes you might load some JSON from the server and then process it on the client side, but still need to run some more JavaScript client side, as one example. The other thing is not every bit of HTML you load via Ajax will have a neat container around it. You could wrap it in a div all the time, but why introduce an extra div? It's as easy to find from the headers, I think.
You said that you don't like Sass because it introduces another level of complexity into CSS, but are you not afraid that processing JavaScript with PRV will create the same thing? Because JavaScript will already have all instruments to control execution flow, etc. And if you just want to use instrumentalization, you can already use some gems or just expose your all your instrumentalization files into JavaScript and just pull them from JavaScript using JavaScript tools.
I think that's a very good point. Two answers. The first is that if you were using ERB in JavaScript, you really shouldn't use it for flow control. You're right about that. You should use the JavaScript flow control. But at the same time, it's nice to be able to drop little things like roots and translations in without having to export the entire set of roots and the entire set of translations, especially with roots where they have parameters, because then the JavaScript also has to have some logic to be able to swap the parameters into the roots, and that seems like duplication. But you're right about flow control. The second part about Sass adding a layer of complication, again, as I said before, that's just my opinion on Sass. I just happen to not really like it, but I've been writing CSS for 10 years, so maybe that's just me being stuck in my ways. But also, ERB in JavaScript, there's a very clear mark which says you are leaving JavaScript, now you're writing Ruby, now you're back in JavaScript again. And as ugly as it looks, I think that's more helpful than just trying to make CSS more complicated.
Sergey Kish, I have one more question about JavaScript. I think now it's the widest language in the world. Every PC, every personal computer, and a lot of browsers, mobile devices have it inside. What is the future of other server-side languages in that point of view? I think each one knows JavaScript, and for example, I know Ruby and Python. Maybe someone knows C#, so all the way going to using JavaScript, isn't it?
There's definitely some very interesting work happening now with JavaScript on the server. Node.js is a really interesting project, and I think particularly there's work to do with building a DOM on the server. So instead of manipulating HTML as strings, kind of saying, okay, here's a P string and then we add an A string to it, having a DOM and using something like jQuery on the server to change the DOM is really, really interesting, especially since you can make one change on the server and then make another change on the client using the same code. But I'm not sure JavaScript's really there yet. The main reason is it uses a very different object model to Ruby and Python and C# and lots of other languages. So I think a lot of developers who are used to classical inheritance find prototypal inheritance a bit hard to get their head around. So I think there are lots of developers who don't want to jump to JavaScript. I don't think Ruby's going anywhere. Personally, I like writing Ruby on the server side, but yeah, hope that helped.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.